Welcome, dear listeners, to a gentle journey through one of history's most transformative periods. Tonight, we'll explore the story of the Black Death, not as a tale of horror, but as a profound chapter in human resilience, adaptation, and renewal. As you settle into your comfortable space, allow yourself to drift back through the centuries, to a time when the world was vastly different from our own. Picture medieval Europe, a tapestry of small villages connected by winding dirt roads, where church bells marked the passage of time, and life moved at the gentle pace of the seasons. The Black Death, which swept across Europe and Asia in the 14th century, was more than just a pandemic. It was a catalyst that would reshape society, economics, art, and human consciousness itself. Tonight, we'll discover how this great mortality, as it was known to those who lived through it, became an unexpected force of change that would help birth the Renaissance and modern world. So close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let us begin this contemplative journey through time, where even in humanity's darkest hours, we find stories of courage, innovation, and hope. Our story begins not with death, but with life, the bustling, vibrant life of medieval trade routes that connected distant corners of the world like golden threads in an enormous tapestry. Picture, if you will, the ancient city of Kaffa, modern-day Feodosia, nestled along the shores of the Black Sea in Crimea. The year is 1346, and this Genoese trading post hums with activity. Merchants from across Europe mingle with traders from the Byzantine Empire, the Golden Horde, and the distant lands of Central Asia. The air is filled with the scent of exotic spices, cinnamon from Ceylon, pepper from India, silk from the Far East. The plague, known to medieval scholars as pestilentia and later called the Black Death, likely originated in the vast steppes of Central Asia. According to the medieval chronicler Gabriel de Mussis, and supported by modern archaeological evidence, the disease may have first emerged in the region around Lake Issyk-Kul in present-day Kyrgyzstan, where ancient Nestorian gravestones from the 1330s mention a mysterious pestilence. The pathogen, Yersinia pestis, had been quietly evolving in the burrows of marmots and other rodents across the Eurasian steppes for centuries. These small creatures, living their peaceful underground lives, harbored fleas that carried the bacteria from host to host. It was a delicate ecological balance that had existed for millennia. But climate change, a cooling period that began in the early 14th century, disrupted this balance. As temperatures dropped and habitats shifted, infected rodents began migrating, bringing their deadly passengers closer to human settlements. The fleas, those tiny, almost invisible creatures no bigger than a grain of rice, became unwitting agents of historical transformation. Trade caravans following the Silk Road, that legendary network of routes connecting east and west, unknowingly carried infected fleas in their grain supplies and fabric bales. Picture these caravans, long trains of camels and horses, their bells tinkling softly in the desert air, carrying not just goods but ideas, technologies, and unfortunately, microscopic stowaways. By 1346, the plague had reached the shores of the Black Sea. The siege of Kaffa by the Mongol Golden Horde became one of history's most consequential military engagements, though not for reasons anyone could have imagined at the time. According to de Mussis's account, the Mongol forces, decimated by the plague, began catapulting infected corpses over the city walls, one of the earliest recorded instances of biological warfare. The Genoese defenders, horrified by this gruesome tactic, eventually abandoned the city. Their ships, laden with goods and unknowingly carrying infected rats and fleas, set sail for ports across the Mediterranean. These vessels became floating incubators, carrying the plague toward the unsuspecting populations of Europe. One can imagine these medieval sailors, weathered by sun and salt, standing at the prows of their ships as familiar coastlines came into view. They had no way of knowing that they were returning home as harbingers of change that would reshape their world forever. To them, they were simply merchants completing another trading voyage, their holds full of precious goods that would bring prosperity to their families and communities. The medieval world had no understanding of bacteria or disease vectors. Their explanations for illness drew from the four humors theory inherited from ancient Greek medicine, astrological influences, and divine providence. When the plague arrived, it seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, striking with a randomness that defied all existing medical knowledge. As we contemplate these origins, we can appreciate how interconnected our world has always been. The same trade networks that brought silk, spices, and cultural exchange also created pathways for pandemic disease. This interconnectedness, which seems so modern to us, was already ancient by the 14th century, woven by countless merchants, diplomats, and travelers who braved vast distances to connect distant civilizations. The autumn of 1347 brought an unseasonable chill to the Mediterranean ports, and with it, ships that would forever change the course of European history. In October of that year, 12 galleys limped into the harbor of Messina, Sicily. These Genoese trading vessels presented a horrifying sight to the dock workers and port officials who came to greet them. Most of the crew lay dead or dying, their bodies covered in dark swellings called buboes, black patches spreading across their skin like ink stains on parchment. The contemporary chronicler Michel de Piazza described the scene with medieval eloquence. The sailors who remained alive were like men returned from the dead, carrying death in their very bones. The authorities, recognizing the danger, ordered the ships to leave immediately, but it was already too late. The invisible enemy had already disembarked. From Messina, the plague spread with the inexorable patience of rising tide. Medieval Europe, with its intricate network of trade routes, pilgrim paths, and river systems, provided countless pathways for the disease to travel. Picture the medieval landscape, networks of Roman roads still serving as major arteries, rivers like the Rhine and Danube carrying commerce and travelers, mountain passes connecting northern and southern regions like doorways through natural walls. The plague reached Marseille by November 1347. This ancient port city, founded by Greek colonists over 1,000 years earlier, had weathered many storms of history. But nothing had prepared it for this. The disease moved through the narrow, crowded streets like water through a sponge. Medieval cities, with their tightly packed wooden buildings, open sewers, and abundant rat populations, provided ideal conditions for the plague's spread. Contemporary accounts describe scenes that seem almost dreamlike in their surreal quality. The physician Guy de Chauliac, who treated plague victims in Avignon, wrote with clinical precision about symptoms that appeared to defy natural explanation. The bubonic form of the plague caused swellings in the lymph nodes, the buboes that gave the disease one of its names, that could grow as large as apples. The pneumonic form attacked the lungs, causing victims to cough blood and struggle for breath. The septicemic form spread through the bloodstream, causing the dark patches that may have inspired the name, Black Death. As winter approached, many hoped the cold weather would halt the disease's advance. Medieval medicine held that extreme cold could purify corrupted air, one of the primary theories for how illness spread. But the plague proved indifferent to human expectations or seasonal rhythms. It continued its march northward, reaching Paris by August 1348. In Paris, the disease found a population already weakened by years of warfare between France and England, poor harvests, and economic instability. The city's university, the most prestigious center of learning in medieval Europe, became a laboratory for understanding the plague. The medical faculty, drawing on centuries of scholarship, proposed various explanations: an unfortunate conjunction of planets, corrupted air caused by earthquakes in distant lands, or divine punishment for humanity's sins. The plague's arrival in England was recorded with particular detail, thanks to the chronicle tradition that flourished in English monasteries. In June 1348, the disease reached the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset. From there, it spread along the coast and inland river valleys. The medieval chronicler Henry Knighton described how the plague moved through England, like fire through stubble, consuming entire communities in its path. What strikes modern readers about these medieval accounts is not just their documentation of suffering, but their attempts to find meaning and pattern in catastrophe. Medieval chroniclers, trained in religious and classical traditions, sought to understand the plague within the frameworks they knew. Some saw it as divine punishment, similar to the plagues described in Exodus. Others interpreted it through the lens of classical literature, comparing it to the plague of Athens described by Thucydides. The plague's movement across Europe followed the rhythms of medieval life. It traveled with merchants along trade routes, with pilgrims journeying to holy sites, with soldiers marching to war, and with the countless unnamed individuals who moved through the medieval world in pursuit of work, adventure, or survival. Each human connection became a potential pathway for transmission. Medieval people had no concept of quarantine as we understand it, though some cities began implementing rudimentary isolation measures. Venice, drawing on its experience with maritime trade and foreign diseases, became one of the first cities to establish systematic isolation procedures for arriving ships. The term quarantine itself derives from the Italian quaranta giorni, referring to the 40-day isolation period that Venice eventually implemented. As the plague spread, it revealed the underlying structure of medieval European society. It followed trade routes, concentrated in urban areas, and moved along the networks of human connection that bound the medieval world together. In doing so, it illuminated patterns of commerce, communication, and social organization that might otherwise remain invisible to historians. The disease respected no boundaries of class, nationality, or faith. Kings and peasants, Christians and Jews, merchants and monks, all found themselves equally vulnerable to this microscopic agent of change. This universal vulnerability would become one of the plague's most profound social legacies, challenging medieval assumptions about divine favor, social hierarchy, and human control over destiny. To understand the Black Death's impact, we must first envision the rhythm of medieval life before its arrival, a world governed by church bells, seasonal cycles, and social hierarchies that had remained largely unchanged for centuries. Picture a typical medieval manor in the English countryside, nestled in a valley where a small river winds between gentle hills. The manor house sits on a rise, built of local stone and timber, its windows few and small, designed more for defense than comfort. Surrounding it are the homes of villagers, modest structures of timber and thatch, their interiors warmed by central hearths that fill the rooms with flickering light and aromatic wood smoke. This was a world of cycles within cycles. The agricultural year began with spring plowing, when oxen would slowly turn the heavy clay soil while children scattered seeds in furrows that had been worked by their ancestors for generations. Summer brought the careful tending of crops, the shearing of sheep, and the endless round of tasks that sustained rural life. Autumn meant harvest time, communities working together to gather grain, with harvest festivals celebrating another year's survival. Winter was a time for repair and reflection, for storytelling by firelight, and for the quiet work that sustained community bonds. Social relationships in this world were complex tapestries woven from obligation, tradition, and mutual dependence. The feudal system, often oversimplified in modern accounts, was actually an intricate web of reciprocal duties. Lords provided protection and land, peasants provided labor and military service. The church provided spiritual guidance, education, and often practical assistance during hard times. When the Black Death arrived, it didn't simply kill people, it unraveled these carefully constructed social fabrics. The mortality rate, estimated by modern historians to have reached 30 to 60% in affected areas, meant that entire networks of relationships suddenly ceased to exist. The chronicler Henry Knighton described how villages became mere deserts, with no one dwelling therein. But the reality was often more complex. Some villages were indeed abandoned entirely. Archaeological evidence reveals settlements that simply vanished during the plague years. Others experienced selective mortality that disrupted traditional hierarchies and relationships in unexpected ways. Consider the impact on agricultural life. Medieval farming required intimate knowledge passed down through generations, which fields were best for which crops, how to read weather patterns, when to plant and harvest for optimal yields. When experienced farmers died in large numbers, this knowledge died with them. Young survivors found themselves responsible for complex agricultural systems they only partially understood. The plague also disrupted the delicate balance of medieval labor systems. In many regions, the sudden scarcity of workers gave surviving peasants unprecedented bargaining power. The English chronicler Thomas Walsingham wrote with evident disapproval about laborers who would not work unless they received excessive wages. This wasn't greed, it was economic adaptation to dramatically changed circumstances. Women found their roles transformed in unexpected ways. In a society where most occupations were rigidly gender-defined, the massive mortality opened opportunities that had never existed before. Women became heads of households, took over businesses, and assumed roles in craft guilds previously reserved for men. The guild records of various European cities show increasing numbers of women practicing trades as diverse as brewing, metalworking, and long-distance commerce. The church, which had provided stability and meaning to medieval life, faced its own transformation. Monasteries, often located in remote areas and following communal lifestyles, suffered devastating mortality rates. The great Abbey of Moe in Yorkshire, according to its chronicle, lost its abbot and most of its monks within months. When new abbots and monks were appointed, they often lacked the learning and experience that had taken centuries to accumulate. This disruption of monastic learning had profound implications for medieval culture. Monasteries had served as libraries, schools, scriptoriums where manuscripts were copied and preserved, and centers of technological innovation. The loss of experienced monks meant the loss of accumulated knowledge in fields as diverse as medicine, agriculture, architecture, and theology. Yet in this disruption, seeds of change were planted. The shortage of clergy meant that church authorities had to relax traditional requirements for education and training. This democratization of religious authority, though unintended, would contribute to religious movements that emphasized personal spirituality over institutional hierarchy. The plague also transformed medieval attitudes toward death and the afterlife. In a world where death had been a distant possibility managed through established religious rituals, sudden mass mortality forced new approaches to grief, memorialization, and spiritual preparation. The memento mori tradition, artistic and literary reminders of mortality, flourished in the plague's aftermath, creating some of medieval Europe's most powerful art and literature. Urban areas experienced their own unique transformations. Cities like London, Paris, and Florence had grown dramatically in the centuries before the plague, their populations sustained by constant migration from rural areas. When the plague struck these crowded urban centers, mortality rates were often even higher than in rural areas. The aftermath revealed the underlying structure of medieval urban life. Entire neighborhoods stood empty, their houses gradually returning to nature as vegetation reclaimed courtyards and gardens. Archaeological excavations in cities like Winchester and Norwich reveal layers of abandonment from the plague years, household goods left where they fell, workshops with tools still arranged on benches, evidence of lives interrupted in mid-activity. But cities also showed remarkable resilience. Survivors consolidated into smaller, more manageable communities. Empty buildings provided opportunities for expansion and improvement. The reduced population pressure led to better living conditions for survivors, who could afford larger homes and better food than their ancestors. This urban transformation had economic implications that rippled across Europe. With fewer consumers, agricultural prices fell while wages rose. With abundant housing, rents decreased while the quality of available accommodations improved. These changes created new patterns of consumption and production that would shape European economic development for centuries. The Black Death had revealed both the fragility and the adaptability of medieval society. Communities that had seemed permanent proved vulnerable to disruption, while new forms of organization emerged from the ruins of the old. It was a transformation that contemporaries experienced as catastrophe but that historians can recognize as the labor pains of a new world being born. In the quiet hours after catastrophe, when the immediate crisis has passed and survivors begin to assess what remains, human creativity often flowers in unexpected ways. The decades following the Black Death witnessed one of history's most remarkable cultural transformations, as European society struggled to make meaning from unprecedented loss. The plague years coincided with what we now recognize as the early Renaissance, though medieval people experienced it not as rebirth but as a fundamental questioning of everything they had once taken for granted. Art, literature, philosophy, and spirituality all evolved in response to a world that seemed to have been turned upside down. Consider the transformation in artistic representation. Before the plague, medieval art had been dominated by symbolic and spiritual themes, with human figures often appearing idealized and otherworldly. The traumatic encounter with mass mortality brought a new emphasis on realism, emotion, and the physical reality of human existence. The Italian painter Andrea Orcagna, working in Florence during and after the plague years, created frescoes that combined traditional religious themes with startlingly realistic portrayals of human suffering and divine judgment. His Triumph of Death, in Pisa's Camposanto, shows death as an inexorable force that strikes rich and poor alike, a theme that would have resonated powerfully with plague survivors who had witnessed exactly this democratic destruction. Literature, too, underwent profound transformation. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, completed around 1353, used the plague as its framing device. 10 young people fleeing Florence tell stories to pass time during their self-imposed quarantine. But the work was more than entertainment. It was a meditation on how human culture survives catastrophe through storytelling, humor, and the bonds of community. Boccaccio's characters don't spend their time in religious contemplation or philosophical speculation. Instead, they tell earthy, human stories that celebrate cleverness, love, and survival. This represented a dramatic shift from earlier medieval literature, which had typically subordinated human concerns to divine ones. The Decameron suggested that human life had value and interest in its own right, independent of its spiritual significance. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, begun in the 1380s, showed similar influence from the post-plague world. Chaucer's pilgrims represent a social order in flux, where traditional hierarchies compete with new forms of authority based on wealth, education, and personal charisma rather than birth or religious position. The wife of Bath, who boasts of outliving 5 husbands, embodies the new possibilities available to survivors in a world where traditional constraints had been swept away. The visual arts experienced perhaps the most dramatic transformation. The international Gothic style that emerged in the late 14th century combined traditional medieval symbolism with increased attention to natural detail, emotional expression, and individual personality. Artists like Simone Martini and the Limbourg brothers created works that maintained spiritual themes while celebrating the beauty and complexity of the physical world. This artistic evolution reflected deeper spiritual changes. The plague had challenged traditional explanations for suffering and divine justice. If the Black Death was punishment for sin, why did it strike righteous and wicked alike? If it was a test of faith, why did prayer and religious devotion seem powerless to prevent it? These questions sparked new forms of religious expression. The Devotio Moderna movement, which emerged in the Netherlands and spread across Northern Europe, emphasized personal spiritual experience over institutional authority. This movement produced practical manuals for spiritual development, like Thomas A. Kempis's The Imitation of Christ, that focused on individual relationship with the divine rather than complex theological doctrine. Mystical traditions also flourished. Julian of Norwich, writing in the late 14th century, experienced visions that emphasized God's love and mercy rather than judgment and punishment. Her Revelations of Divine Love suggested that suffering, even on the scale of the Black Death, could be understood as part of divine love rather than divine wrath. All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, she wrote, words that offered comfort to a traumatized generation. The plague years also witnessed the emergence of new forms of popular religious expression. The flagellant movement saw groups of penitents traveling from town to town, publicly whipping themselves in hopes of appeasing divine anger. While church authorities eventually condemned these movements as heretical, they represented genuine attempts by ordinary people to find spiritual responses to unprecedented crisis. Dance emerged as another form of cultural expression shaped by plague experience. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became a popular artistic motif, showing skeletons leading people from all walks of life in a final dance. These images appeared in manuscripts, church frescoes, and public art across Europe, serving as both memento mori and democratizing statements about human equality in the face of death. The transformation of educational institutions reflected broader cultural changes. Universities, which had suffered significant mortality among both faculty and students, gradually restructured their curricula to address new intellectual challenges. The University of Paris, for example, began offering more practical courses in medicine, law, and natural philosophy, responding to post-plague society's need for skilled professionals who could address immediate problems rather than abstract theoretical questions. Medical knowledge underwent particular transformation. The plague's resistance to traditional treatments based on the four humors theory forced physicians to observe and record symptoms with unprecedented precision. This empirical approach, born from necessity, contributed to the gradual development of more scientific approaches to understanding disease and human anatomy. Architecture, too, reflected changing cultural priorities. The elaborate cathedral building projects that had dominated the 13th century gave way to more practical construction focused on urban infrastructure, hospitals, and educational institutions. When churches were built, they often featured more intimate spaces designed for personal prayer rather than the vast communal ceremonies that had characterized pre-plague religious life. The transformation in attitudes toward time and mortality had profound implications for how people approached daily life. The medieval concept of time as cyclical and eternal began competing with a more linear understanding that emphasized the urgency of present action. This shift contributed to what historians recognize as the emergence of Renaissance humanism, the belief that human life and achievement have intrinsic value worthy of celebration and preservation. Music, too, evolved in response to post-plague sensibilities. The complex polyphony of medieval sacred music began incorporating more emotional and expressive elements. Composers like Guillaume de Machaut created works that combined traditional liturgical forms with more personal, emotional content that spoke to individual experience rather than collective worship. All these cultural transformations shared common themes: increased attention to individual experience, greater realism in representing human life, and new emphasis on personal agency and responsibility. They suggest a society learning to see itself differently, finding new sources of meaning and value in human creativity, relationships, and achievements rather than relying solely on traditional religious and social authorities for guidance. This cultural flowering represented not just recovery from trauma, but transformation of that trauma into sources of creativity and insight. The Black Death had forced European society to confront fundamental questions about mortality, meaning, and human value. The answers that emerged from this confrontation would shape Western culture for centuries to come. The morning after catastrophe often reveals a landscape transformed in ways that seem impossible to those who knew what came before. In the decades following the Black Death, European society discovered that demographic catastrophe had created opportunities for social change that would have been unimaginable in the stable hierarchies of the pre-plague world. The most immediate transformation was economic. With population reduced by 1/3 to 1/2 in many regions, the basic relationship between land, labor, and capital had fundamentally shifted. Land, which had been the primary source of wealth and power in medieval society, suddenly became abundant relative to the people available to work it. Labor, previously cheap and readily available, became a precious and contested resource. This shift created opportunities that rippled through every level of society. English court records from the 1350s and 1360s document thousands of cases where peasants abandoned their traditional holdings to seek better opportunities elsewhere. The Statute of Labourers, passed by the English Parliament in 1351, attempted to freeze wages and prevent worker mobility, but its very existence testified to the social changes already underway. Consider the transformation in the life of a typical English peasant family. Before the plague, the hypothetical family of Thomas the Ploughman might have held a few acres of land from their local lord, paying rent through labor service and a portion of their harvest. Thomas's son would have expected to inherit this same arrangement, spending his life working the same fields his father had worked. After the plague, with neighboring holdings abandoned and landlords desperate for workers, Thomas's son might find himself able to lease additional land, demand wages for his labor, or even abandon agriculture entirely to learn a craft in a nearby town. The social mobility that had been virtually impossible in the rigid hierarchies of pre-plague society suddenly became not just possible but necessary for economic survival. Women experienced particularly dramatic changes in their social and economic opportunities. Medieval society had strictly defined gender roles, but the massive mortality created gaps that could only be filled by survivors regardless of traditional restrictions. Guild records from cities across Europe show women entering trades previously reserved for men, taking over family businesses, and even serving in civic positions that had been exclusively male. The story of Marjorie Kemp, whose autobiography provides one of our most detailed accounts of post-plague life, illustrates these new possibilities. Born around 1373, Kemp became a successful businesswoman, running both brewing and milling operations. Her ability to travel extensively on pilgrimages, despite being married with children, suggests a level of personal independence that would have been unusual for women in earlier centuries. The transformation of urban life was equally dramatic. Cities like London, Paris, and Florence had grown rapidly in the centuries before the plague, creating crowded conditions and fierce competition for resources. The sudden reduction in urban population created opportunities for survivors to improve their living conditions dramatically. Archaeological evidence from cities like London reveals that houses abandoned during the plague years were often subdivided and improved by survivors. Gardens and orchards appeared in spaces that had previously been crowded with buildings. Property records show that survivors were able to afford larger, better constructed homes than their pre-plague predecessors. These improved living conditions had cascading effects on urban culture. With more space and resources available, cities could support larger numbers of artisans, artists, and intellectuals. The Renaissance flowering that began in Italian cities like Florence was made possible partly by the economic opportunities created by demographic collapse. The Medici banking empire, for example, emerged in the post-plague economy where traditional commercial relationships had been disrupted and new opportunities abounded. The transformation of political structures was equally significant. The feudal system, based on personal relationships between lords and vassals, had depended on stable populations and traditional arrangements. The plague disrupted these relationships so thoroughly that new forms of political organization became necessary. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 represented one of the most dramatic expressions of these social changes. Led by figures like Wat Tyler and John Ball, the revolt challenged not just specific economic policies but the fundamental assumptions of feudal hierarchy. When John Ball asked, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" he was articulating a vision of social equality that the plague years had made seem possible. Though the revolt was ultimately suppressed, it demonstrated that traditional authority could no longer be taken for granted. English kings and nobles were forced to negotiate with their subjects in ways that would have been unthinkable before the plague. The development of Parliament as a genuine check on royal authority owed much to these post-plague social transformations. Similar changes occurred across Europe. In France, the Jacquerie Revolt of 1358 had shown the potential for popular uprising even before the plague's full social impact had been realized. In the German states, the growing power of merchant guilds and urban leagues challenged traditional noble authority. The Italian city-states developed new forms of republican government that balanced competing interests in ways that feudal monarchy could not match. The Church, too, was forced to adapt to new social realities. The massive mortality among clergy had necessitated the rapid ordination of replacement priests, often with less education and training than their predecessors. This democratization of religious authority contributed to reform movements that emphasized personal spirituality over institutional hierarchy. The Lollard movement in England, influenced by John Wycliffe's writings, called for church reforms that would make religious authority more accountable to ordinary believers. Similar movements across Europe challenged clerical privileges and demanded that religious institutions serve the needs of their communities rather than simply extracting resources from them. Educational institutions underwent similar transformation. Universities, which had been primarily training grounds for clergy and a small elite, gradually opened their doors to students from merchant and artisan families. The practical skills needed in post-plague society, law, medicine, engineering, and commerce, became as valued as traditional theological and philosophical studies. The emergence of vernacular literature reflected these social changes. While Latin had been the language of learning and formal culture, writers increasingly used local languages to reach broader audiences. This democratization of literacy and literature created new forms of cultural expression that spoke to the experiences of ordinary people rather than just educated elites. The transformation of marriage and family structures was equally significant. In pre-plague society, marriage had been primarily an economic and social arrangement designed to preserve and transmit property. The disruption of traditional property relationships created new possibilities for marriages based on personal choice and affection. Court records from the post-plague period show increasing numbers of marriages that crossed traditional social boundaries. Wealthy widows, who had inherited property from plague victims, found themselves able to choose new husbands based on personal preference rather than family pressure. Young people who had inherited resources at early ages could make marriage decisions independently of parental control. These social transformations created a world that was recognizably more modern than medieval in many respects. Social mobility, personal choice, urban opportunities, and challenges to traditional authority all became more common in post-plague Europe. The rigid hierarchies that had characterized medieval society gave way to more fluid arrangements that rewarded talent, ambition, and adaptability. Yet this transformation was neither immediate nor complete. Traditional forms of authority adapted and reasserted themselves in new ways. The changes unleashed by the plague created centuries of social tension and conflict as different groups struggled to define their roles in the emerging world. The Black Death had revealed that social arrangements that seemed permanent and natural could be transformed almost overnight. This recognition would influence European thought and culture for centuries, contributing to everything from religious reform movements to political revolutions to economic transformations. The plague years had taught Europeans that change was possible, a lesson they would not forget. As we approach the end of our gentle journey through this transformative period in human history, let us consider how the echoes of the Black Death continue to resonate through the centuries, shaping the world we inhabit today in ways both obvious and subtle. The immediate aftermath of the plague was not, as one might expect, a period of continued decline and despair. Instead, the survivors found themselves inheriting a world of unprecedented opportunity. The economic historian David Herlihy called this the golden age of the European peasant, a time when ordinary people enjoyed living standards that would not be seen again until the Industrial Revolution. Archaeological evidence supports this assessment. Excavations of peasant homes from the late 14th and early 15th centuries reveal larger houses, more personal possessions, and better nutrition than their pre-plague ancestors enjoyed. Skeletons from post-plague cemeteries show evidence of improved health and longer lifespans among survivors. The reduced population pressure had created what we might call a demographic dividend, more resources available for each surviving individual. This material improvement created conditions for cultural and intellectual flowering that we recognize as the Renaissance. The patronage system that supported artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo was made possible partly by the concentration of wealth that occurred in post-plague society. Wealthy survivors could afford to commission art, literature, and architecture on a scale that had been impossible when resources were spread more thinly across larger populations. The plague's impact on scientific and medical knowledge was equally profound. The failure of traditional medical approaches to prevent or treat the disease forced practitioners to observe and record symptoms with unprecedented precision. This empirical approach gradually evolved into more scientific methods of understanding disease and human anatomy. The Italian physician Marsilio Ficino, writing in the late 15th century, developed theories about disease transmission that anticipated modern understanding of contagion. His work built on observations made during the plague years, when physicians like Guy de Chauliac had carefully documented the disease's progression and spread patterns. The transformation of European agriculture represented another lasting legacy. The labor shortage forced survivors to develop more efficient farming methods and to abandon marginal lands that had been cultivated during the population pressure of the 13th century. This agricultural intensification created surpluses that supported urban growth and craft specialization. New crops and farming techniques spread rapidly through networks of knowledge exchange that the plague had actually strengthened. Survivors were more willing to experiment with innovation when traditional methods had proven insufficient. The moldboard plow became more widely adopted. Three-field crop rotation systems spread to regions that had previously used less efficient methods, and selective breeding of livestock improved productivity. The political transformations unleashed by the plague continued to evolve long after the disease itself had faded from immediate concern. The challenges to traditional authority that had emerged in movements like the Peasants' Revolt continued to influence political development across Europe. The rise of parliamentary institutions in England owed much to the social changes initiated by the plague years. When traditional feudal relationships had been disrupted, new forms of political organization became necessary. The English Parliament evolved from a royal advisory body into a genuine check on monarchical power, partly because post-plague society required more flexible and responsive governance. Similar developments occurred across Europe. The Italian city-states pioneered republican forms of government that balanced competing interests through institutional mechanisms rather than traditional hierarchies. These experiments in self-governance would influence political thinking for centuries, contributing to ideas about democracy and popular sovereignty that would eventually spread across the globe. The Church, too, continued to evolve in response to challenges that had emerged during the plague years. The reform movements that had begun as responses to clerical mortality gradually developed into more fundamental challenges to religious authority. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century had roots in the democratization of religious authority that had begun 3 centuries earlier. The cultural changes initiated by the plague years proved equally lasting. The increased attention to individual experience and personal agency that had emerged from confrontation with mass mortality became central themes in European art, literature, and philosophy. The humanist movement that celebrated human achievement and potential drew on insights that had emerged from the plague generation's struggle to find meaning in catastrophe. The transformation of educational institutions created by the plague continued to evolve as well. Universities that had been forced to admit students from broader social backgrounds gradually developed curricula that addressed practical as well as theoretical concerns. The rise of empirical science, practical engineering, and professional education all built on foundations laid during the post-plague recovery. Perhaps most significantly, the plague years had demonstrated that dramatic social change was possible. Medieval Europeans had lived in a world where social arrangements seemed as permanent and unchangeable as natural law. The Black Death revealed that human societies were more flexible and adaptable than anyone had imagined. This recognition that change was possible influenced European attitudes toward exploration, innovation, and social experimentation. The age of exploration that began in the 15th century was undertaken by societies that had learned to see opportunity in disruption and transformation. The colonization of the Americas, the development of global trade networks, and the scientific revolution all reflected confidence in human ability to reshape their world through deliberate action. The economic innovations that emerged from post-plague society also proved enduring. The banking systems developed by families like the Medici, the insurance markets that emerged to manage commercial risks, and the accounting methods that allowed for more sophisticated business planning all built on opportunities created by demographic transformation. The plague had also fundamentally altered European attitudes toward death and mortality. The medieval world had understood death as a transition to eternal life, with elaborate rituals designed to ensure proper spiritual preparation. The mass mortality of the plague years forced survivors to develop more practical approaches to grief, memorialization, and life planning. This transformation appears in the art and literature of subsequent centuries. The memento mori tradition that flourished after the plague created some of Europe's most powerful artistic achievements, from the Danse Macabre frescoes that appeared in churches across the continent to the skull imagery that became common in portraiture and still-life painting. The plague experience also influenced European approaches to public health and urban planning. Italian cities like Venice and Genoa, which had been among the first to implement quarantine measures, continued to develop more sophisticated approaches to disease prevention. These innovations spread across Europe, creating administrative systems for managing public health that would prove crucial during later epidemics. The concept of quarantine itself represents one of the plague's most lasting institutional legacies. The 40-day isolation period developed by Venetian authorities became a standard practice that continues to influence public health policy today. Modern epidemiological approaches to disease containment still draw on principles developed during the Black Death. The transformation of gender roles that had begun during the plague years also proved lasting, though often in complex and contradictory ways. Women who had assumed economic and social responsibilities during the crisis found it difficult to maintain these roles as traditional authorities reasserted themselves. Yet the precedent of female capability and independence had been established, creating possibilities that would be recalled and built upon in later centuries. The guild records of cities like London and Paris show that women continued to participate in crafts and trades at higher rates than before the plague, though often facing restrictions and limitations that had not existed during the immediate crisis. These struggles over women's economic roles would continue for centuries, with the plague years serving as a reference point for what women could achieve when circumstances demanded it. As we reflect on this remarkable period of transformation, we can see that the Black Death was far more than a demographic catastrophe. It was a catalyst that accelerated changes already beginning in medieval society and created new possibilities that might not have emerged for centuries, if at all. The survivors of the plague created a world that was recognizably more modern than medieval in its social mobility, economic dynamism, cultural creativity, and political flexibility. They had learned that human societies could be rebuilt and reimagined, that traditional authorities could be challenged and replaced, and that catastrophe could become the foundation for renewal. This lesson would resonate through European history, influencing everything from religious reformation to political revolution to scientific advancement. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the Age of Exploration, and even the Enlightenment all built on insights and opportunities that emerged from the plague years. Yet perhaps the most profound legacy of the Black Death lies not in any specific institutional or cultural achievement, but in its demonstration of human resilience and creativity. The survivors who rebuilt European society after the plague showed that communities could endure almost unimaginable loss and still find ways to create meaning, beauty, and hope. Their stories remind us that even in our darkest hours, human beings possess remarkable capacities for adaptation, innovation, and renewal. The medieval Europeans who lived through the plague years faced challenges that seemed insurmountable, yet they not only survived but created foundations for centuries of cultural and social development. As you settle into sleep tonight, carry with you this gentle reminder that human communities have weathered catastrophes before and emerged not just intact, but transformed and strengthened. The story of the Black Death is ultimately a story of human resilience, of ordinary people who found extraordinary ways to rebuild their world when everything they had known seemed to have been swept away. In the quiet spaces between sleeping and waking, perhaps you can imagine yourself walking through a medieval town in the years after the plague, not the abandoned ruins you might expect, but a community buzzing with new energy and possibility. The survivors have planted gardens in empty lots, converted abandoned buildings into workshops and schools, and filled the air with the sounds of construction and creativity. The bells that ring the hours now mark not just the passage of time, but the rhythm of renewal. In their gentle chimes, we hear the eternal human capacity to find hope in the aftermath of despair, to build beauty from the materials of loss, and to create tomorrow from the remnants of yesterday. Sleep well, dear listeners, in the knowledge that you are part of this continuing story of human resilience and renewal. The same creativity and adaptability that allowed our ancestors to transform catastrophe into opportunity flows through you as well, ready to meet whatever challenges and possibilities tomorrow may bring.